Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do every week. Today's story is one that defies every law of physics and logic known to man. It is a story about a man who tried to hide a secret so deep that the earth itself should have swallowed it forever. But as he would soon find out, some things simply refuse to stay buried. Elias Thorne was a man who lived his life by the measurement of a level and the strike of a hammer. At 58 years old, he had spent over 30 years as a high-end contractor in the rugged, forested terrain of northern Vermont. He was a man of cold, hard facts. He did not believe in luck, he did not believe in fate, and he certainly did not believe in ghosts. To Elias, if you could not see it, touch it, or bolt it down to a foundation, it did not exist. He was the kind of man who woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, drank his coffee black, and could tell you the moisture content of a piece of oak just by the weight of it in his palm. He had built hundreds of homes, reinforced dozens of crumbling structures, and he took pride in the fact that when Elias Thorne built something, it stayed built. In the late autumn of 2024, Elias took on a project that most other contractors in the county had turned down. It was the total renovation and stabilization of the old Miller estate. This was a sprawling Victorian-style farmhouse that sat precariously on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the Blackwood Valley. The house had been vacant for nearly 40 years. The last of the Miller family had disappeared under circumstances that the locals only whispered about over lukewarm coffee at the town diner. They said the house was heavy. Not heavy in terms of weight or structural mass, but heavy in terms of the very air inside of it. People claimed that birds would not land on the roof and that the wind seemed to whistle through the eaves in a way that sounded almost like human speech. Elias did not care about town, gossip, or local superstitions. He cared about the substantial paycheck the Historical Society was offering to stabilize the foundation before the whole structure slid into the ravine. The cellar was the priority. It was a dark, damp cavern of hand-hewn stone and packed dirt that smelled of ancient rot, wet minerals, and something metallic that Elias could not quite identify. It felt as though the basement was breathing, a slow and rhythmic expansion and contraction of the cold mountain air. On a Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, Elias was alone in that cellar. He was using a heavy-duty pickaxe to clear out a section of the floor where the ground had heaved, threatening the integrity of the main support beam. He swung the tool with the rhythmic precision of a man half his age, his muscles burning under his flannel shirt. On the 12th swing, the pickaxe did not thud into the packed dirt. Instead, it let out a sharp, metallic ping that vibrated all the way up Elias's arms and into his teeth. It was a sound that should not have been there. He stopped and wiped the sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. He knelt down in the dirt, his knees cracking. He began to dig with a hand trowel, expecting to find a rusted pipe or perhaps an old farm tool buried by a previous generation. But what he uncovered was something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. Buried 3 feet under the surface was a box. It was made of a dull, heavy iron roughly the size of a microwave. It was wrapped in thick, rusted chains that looked as though they had been fused together by immense heat. There was no keyhole, there was no visible seam where a lid might meet a base. But the most unsettling thing about it was the temperature. Despite being buried in the cool 45-degree earth of a Vermont cellar, the box was warm. Not just warm, but pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat like a living heart. Elias felt a wave of nausea hit him so hard he had to lean against the stone wall. His instinct, honed by decades of working in dangerous environments, screamed at him to get out. He did not know what was in that box, but every fiber of his being told him that it was something that should never have seen the light of day. He stood there for a long time, the only sound being his own ragged breathing and the distant drip of water from a leaky pipe. Elias Thorne was not a man who panicked, but that night, he did something entirely out of character. He did not call the Historical Society. He did not call the police. He felt an irrational, overwhelming need to put as much distance between himself and that object as possible. It was as if the box was emitting a frequency that bypassed his logic and went straight to the primitive, fearful part of his brain. He used a heavy-duty floor jack to hoist the iron box out of the hole. It felt much heavier than it looked, perhaps hundreds of pounds, as if it were filled with lead or solid gold. He loaded it into the back of his Ford F-150 and covered it with a heavy, oil-stained tarp. He drove for 3 hours, heading north, deep into the heart of the Green Mountain National Forest. He was driving toward a place known to the locals as the Devil's Throat. It was a massive, natural sinkhole that dropped nearly 200 feet into an underground river system. It was a place where things went to disappear, a geological anomaly that the forest seemed to be trying to hide. Under the light of a waning moon, Elias hauled the box to the edge of the precipice. His lungs burned in the freezing October air, and his heart was racing at 100 beats per minute. He did not pray, and he did not say goodbye. He simply tipped the box over the edge. He watched it disappear into the black maw of the earth. He waited for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but the sound never came. It just vanished into the silence of the night. Elias drove home, feeling a sense of profound relief. He arrived at his own house, a modest, 2-story colonial 10 miles outside of town, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. He took a long shower, scrubbing the cellar dirt from under his fingernails until his skin was raw. He collapsed into bed, and for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. Until the next morning. At 6 o'clock, Elias walked into his kitchen to make a pot of coffee. He reached for the cabinet where he kept his mugs, but his hand stopped mid-air. There, sitting in the center of his kitchen island, was the iron box. It was exactly as he had found it. The rusted chains were still fused around it, the dull iron surface still looked ancient and weathered, but there was one terrifying difference. The box was wet. It was dripping with a dark, brackish water that smelled of the underground river at the bottom of the Devil's Throat. And it was still warm. Elias backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked his front door. It was locked from the inside. He checked his windows. They were all latched. There was no sign of a break-in, no mud on the floor, no wet footprints leading from the entryway. Just the box, sitting silently on his granite countertop as if it had always belonged there. Elias tried to convince himself he was hallucinating. He was a man of logic, and logic dictated that a 300-pound iron box cannot travel 60 miles through the woods and through a locked door on its own. He thought perhaps someone was playing a prank on him, a cruel and elaborate joke played by the people in town who knew he was working at the Miller place, but the heat coming off the box was real. He could feel it from 5 feet away, a shimmering distortion in the air. Driven by a mixture of terror and fury, Elias decided he would not be intimidated. If 60 miles was not enough, he would go further. He spent the day at a local construction site, taking several bags of high-strength, quick-dry concrete. He returned home, hauled the box back into his truck, and drove toward the coast of Maine. He arrived at a remote stretch of the Atlantic shoreline just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the water. He rented a small motorized skiff from a sleepy marina, telling the attendant he was going out for some night fishing. He loaded the box, the concrete, and a large plastic drum onto the boat. 3 miles out at sea, where the water depth was recorded at over 400 feet, Elias went to work. He placed the iron box inside the plastic drum. He poured the wet concrete over it, filling the drum to the very brim. He waited 2 hours for the mixture to harden into a solid 1,000-pound pillar of stone. He looked at the gray, unyielding mass and felt a sense of finality. Using a winching system he had rigged to the side of the skiff, he pushed the drum overboard. It hit the water with a massive splash and sank instantly, trailing a line of bubbles until the ocean surface was once again as smooth as glass. Elias stayed at a motel that night. He could not bring himself to go back to his empty house. He checked into a roadside place called the Seafoam Inn at 11 o'clock. He locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle, and sat on the edge of the bed with a loaded shotgun across his knees. He did not sleep a wink, watching the shadows move across the wall until the sun came up. At dawn, he drove back to Vermont. He approached his house with the trepidation of a soldier entering a minefield. He unlocked his front door, his hand trembling so hard the keys jingled like wind chimes. He stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. The island was clear. Elias let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. He slumped onto his sofa and closed his eyes. He had won. Whatever that thing was, whatever law of nature it was breaking, it was now at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, encased in a tomb of concrete. He decided he needed a drink to steady his nerves. He walked toward his basement stairs to retrieve a bottle of bourbon he kept on a shelf in his workshop. He flipped the light switch and headed down the wooden steps. He stopped on the fourth step. The basement floor was covered in 6 inches of salt water, the air smelled of brine and seaweed, and there, sitting in the middle of the flooded floor, was the iron box. But it was not just sitting there. This time, it was different. The concrete he had poured around it was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. But the surface of the iron was covered in fresh barnacles and clinging sea anemones that were still pulsing with life. The box was vibrating now, a low-frequency hum that Elias could feel in the marrow of his bones. And the chains, the fused, rusted chains that had held it shut for perhaps a century, they were beginning to crack. At this point, Elias Thorne's mind began to fracture. He was a man who had lived 60 years believing the world worked a certain way. You build a wall and it stays upright. You dig a hole and it stays empty. But this was a direct assault on the foundation of his reality. He did not go to work. He did not answer his phone. He spent the next 48 hours sitting in his living room, staring at the basement door. He could hear the box humming. It sounded like 1,000 bees trapped in a lead pipe. Every few hours, he would hear a sharp clink, the sound of another link in those ancient chains snapping under an internal pressure that defied explanation. He realized then that the box was not coming back to him in a physical sense. It was not traveling. It was tethered to him. Or perhaps it was tethered to the concept of home. By finding it in that cellar at the Miller estate, he had somehow invited it into his life, and now it refused to be uninvited. He felt a deep, soul-aching connection to the object, a magnetic pull that was drawing him back down into the basement. On the third night, Elias had a realization. If he could not hide it and he could not destroy it, he would have to face it. But first, he would try one last desperate act, an act that defied everything he stood for as a builder. He went into his garage and grabbed his industrial oxyacetylene torch. He descended into the flooded basement, his boots splashing in the seawater that refused to drain despite the sump pump running constantly. He knelt before the box. The heat coming off it was now so intense that the water around it was beginning to simmer. Steam rose in thick white plumes, filling the basement with a ghostly fog that obscured the walls. Elias ignited the torch. The blue flame hissed with the temperature of 5,000 degrees. He aimed the tip at the center of the box, intending to melt the iron into a puddle of slag. He wanted to see what was inside, to kill whatever heart was beating within that metal shell. As soon as the flame touched the metal, the humming stopped. The basement fell into a silence so absolute it felt like he had gone deaf. Then a voice spoke. It did not come from the box. It did not come from the air. It came from inside Elias's own skull, echoing against his temples. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stones and shifting earth, a voice that had not spoken in an age. It said, "You cannot bury what is already inside." The iron box began to glow with a dull internal light, shifting from black to a deep, bruised purple. The remaining chains did not just break, they evaporated into red dust that hung in the steaming air. Elias dropped the torch into the water, where it hissed and died. He tried to run, he tried to scramble back up the stairs, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the concrete floor. He looked down and saw that the seawater was no longer water. It was shadows. dark, liquid shadows that were rising up his legs, pinning him in place like quicksand. The lid of the box, which had no hinges, began to slide upward with a sound like grinding teeth. It did not reveal gold or jewels or even a body. It revealed a mirror. But it was not a mirror that reflected the basement or Elias's terrified, tear-streaked face. It reflected the Miller estate. Specifically, it reflected the cellar where he had first found the box. Elias watched in horror as the image in the mirror shifted. He saw a man in the cellar. The man was holding a pickaxe. The man was swinging it with the rhythmic precision of a contractor. He saw the pickaxe hit something metallic. He saw the man kneel down and uncover an iron box wrapped in fused chains. The man in the mirror was Elias. But it was not the Elias of 3 days ago. It was an Elias who looked much older, his hair completely white, his skin like yellowed parchment stretched over bone. The Elias in the mirror looked up, and for a split second, their eyes met. The mirror Elias had an expression of such profound, soul-shattering despair that the real Elias felt his heart skip a beat. It was the look of a man who had been caught in a loop for an eternity. Then, the box snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. The shadows receded instantly. The seawater vanished. The steam cleared, leaving the air cold and dry. Elias was standing in his basement, alone. The floor was bone dry. The air was cool and smelled of nothing but dust and old wood. The iron box was gone. There were no barnacles, no salt, no evidence that anything had happened at all. Elias stumbled back, gasping for air, his lungs feeling as though they were filled with ash. He ran upstairs, checking every room, every closet, every cabinet. The box was nowhere to be found. He checked his kitchen island. It was clear. He checked his truck. The bed was empty. He sat in his living room for hours, waiting for the humming to start again. He waited for the smell of brine or the feeling of heat, but nothing happened. The world was normal again. The laws of physics had been restored, and the sun began to rise over the Vermont hills, casting a beautiful, deceptive light over the landscape. He convinced himself it had been a nervous breakdown. The stress of the Miller project, the isolation of the rural house, the legends he had heard at the diner, it had all combined to create a vivid, terrifying hallucination. He decided right then and there to quit the job. He would call the Historical Society and tell them he was retiring, effective immediately. He would sell his house and move somewhere flat, somewhere new, somewhere without a history. He went to his bedroom to pack a bag. He wanted to go to Florida or Arizona or anywhere that did not have cellars or mountains. He opened his closet to grab his suitcase, but his hand froze on the handle. There, sitting on the floor of his closet, was a small wooden crate. It was not the iron box. It was a simple, handcrafted box made of oak. It looked familiar, like something he might have built himself years ago. Elias reached out and touched it. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He pulled the lid open with a trembling hand. Inside the box was a photograph. It was a black and white image, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. It showed the Miller farmhouse as it looked in the year 1895. Standing on the front porch was a family, the father, the mother, and 2 small children. Elias looked closer at the father. The man was wearing a heavy canvas coat and holding a hammer. He had the same eyes as Elias, the same jawline, the same way of standing with his shoulders slightly hunched. Elias turned the photograph over. In faded, elegant script, someone had written a single sentence. "We tried to bury the truth deep underground, but it was waiting at home." Elias Thorne did not go to Florida. He did not even leave his house that day. The next morning, he received a phone call from the president of the Blackwood Historical Society. The man sounded frantic, his voice cracking over the line. "Elias, thank God you answered. We just got word from the site. The structural engineers went into the cellar to check your progress, and they found something. Something impossible." Elias felt a cold numbness spreading through his limbs, starting at his toes and moving toward his heart. "What did they find?" "The hole you dug," the man said, his voice trembling. "They found a body in it." But Elias, that is not the strange part. The body was encased in a pillar of modern high-strength concrete, and it was wearing a watch. a watch that was manufactured in the year 2024. Elias dropped the phone. He did not need to hear the rest. He knew whose body was in that concrete. He knew whose watch it was. He walked to his bathroom and looked in the mirror. He watched as his hair, strand by strand, turned from salt and pepper to a ghostly, stark white. He watched as the wrinkles on his face deepened into the lines of the man he had seen in the mirror of the iron box. He understood now. The box was not an object. It was a marker. It was a physical manifestation of a debt that had been owed by his bloodline for over 100 years. The Millers had not disappeared. They had been folded into the very foundation of the land, and the land was finally calling for the rest of the debt to be paid. Elias, by digging in that cellar, had stepped back into the gears of a machine that had never stopped turning. He walked out of his house and got into his truck. He did not drive to the police. He did not drive to a hospital. He drove back to the Miller estate. He walked down into the cellar. The engineers were gone, likely fleeing in terror or calling for reinforcements from the capital. The hole was there, gaping like an open wound in the earth. The pillar of concrete sat in the center, partially unearthed, looking exactly like the one he had dropped into the Atlantic Ocean. Elias climbed into the hole. He lay down on top of the cold, hard concrete that contained his own future corpse. He closed his eyes and felt the heat beginning to rise from the dirt beneath him. He heard the faint, rhythmic pulse of a heart. Thump, 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 thump. The earth began to shift. The stones of the foundation began to groan and wail as if they were alive. He felt the shadows rising from the corners of the room, liquid and dark, wrapping around his ankles and his waist like the arms of a long-lost relative. He was not afraid anymore. He was a man of logic after all, and the logic here was simple. Some things are meant to stay buried, and if you are the one who uncovers them, you become part of the secret. As the dirt began to spill over the edge of the hole, covering his legs, then his chest, then his face, Elias Thorne heard one final sound. It was the sound of an iron box clicking shut, the chains fusing together with a heat that felt like a warm embrace. When the police arrived at the Miller estate 2 hours later, they found the cellar exactly as it had been for 40 years. There was no hole, there was no concrete pillar, there was no body. The floor was solid, packed dirt, undisturbed and silent. The Historical Society searched for Elias Thorne for months. They found his truck parked in the driveway, the keys still in the ignition, and his half-eaten lunch on the passenger seat. They found his house 10 miles away, perfectly maintained, with a fresh pot of coffee still sitting on the burner, cold and black. But Elias Thorne was gone. The locals still talk about the Blackwood Valley. They say that if you go to the old Miller estate on a quiet October night, when the moon is waning and the air is 45 degrees, you can hear something strange coming from the ground beneath your feet. It is not a ghost. It is not a scream. It is the sound of a hammer hitting a nail over and over again, a man trying to build a home inside a grave. And if you are brave enough to walk down into that cellar, you might find something sitting in the middle of the floor. A dull iron box wrapped in fused chains, pulsing with a heat that defies every law of science known to man. But if I were you, I would leave it exactly where it is. Because as Elias Thorne learned the hard way, you can bury a secret as deep as you want, you can throw it into a sinkhole or sink it in the deepest part of the ocean, but it will always be waiting for you when you get home. If you found this story compelling, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We release 3 or 4 new stories every single week. Until next time, stay safe and keep your doors locked. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Because today, we are going to look at a case that defies every known law of physics, optics, and human biology. This is the story of a man named Arthur Miller, a clockmaker from a small, quiet town in Vermont, who discovered that the man in the mirror wasn't actually him. The man who lived by the second Arthur Miller was a man of absolute routine. At 62 years old, he had spent the better part of 4 decades hunched over a workbench, peering through a jeweler's loupe at the tiny brass heartbeats of grandfather clocks and pocket watches. He liked things that made sense. He liked things that followed the rules of gear ratios and tension. In Arthur's world, if something was broken, there was a logical reason why, and there was always a way to fix it. He lived alone in a house built in the late 1800s. It was a sturdy, creaky place filled with the constant rhythmic tick-tock of dozens of timepieces. To anyone else, the noise would be maddening. To Arthur, it was the sound of safety. It meant everything was in its proper place. Everything was synchronized. But on a cold Tuesday in November, during the year 2024, that synchronization began to unravel in the most impossible way imaginable. The first discrepancy. It started in the bathroom. It was approximately 6:15 in the morning. Arthur had just finished shaving. He was using a straight razor, a tool that requires immense focus and a steady hand. He wiped the remaining foam from his chin with a warm towel and looked into the medicine cabinet mirror to check his work. Now, we've all looked in the mirror thousands of times. We know exactly how it works. You move, it moves. You blink, it blinks. It is a perfect, instantaneous physical law. But as Arthur reached out to close the cabinet door, he noticed something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. As his hand moved toward the door handle, his reflection's hand lagged, just for a fraction of a second. It was so subtle that Arthur initially dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps a dizzy spell from standing up too quickly. He paused, his hand hovering an inch away from the glass. He waited. The reflection waited too. Arthur moved his hand back. The reflection followed. He moved it again. This time, it was perfect. He let out a long breath, shook his head, and muttered something about needing a stronger prescription for his glasses. He closed the cabinet, the glass swinging shut, and he walked out of the room. He didn't see that. For 2 seconds after he turned his back, the reflection in the closed mirror stayed perfectly still, staring at the back of his head. The persistence of vision. Over the next week, the glitches became harder to ignore. Arthur began to conduct small, secret tests. He would be brushing his teeth and suddenly stop, trying to catch the reflection off guard. He would wink rapidly. He would make strange faces. Most of the time, everything was normal. But then, on Friday night, as the clock in the hallway struck 11 o'clock, Arthur went to wash his face before bed. He splashed cold water on his skin, kept his eyes closed for a moment, and then looked up into the mirror while patting his face dry with a towel. He wasn't smiling. He was tired. His eyes were heavy and his mouth was set in a neutral downward line. But the man in the mirror? The man in the mirror was grinning. It wasn't a friendly grin. It wasn't the smile of a man who had just heard a good joke. It was a wide, toothy, ear-to-ear leer that stretched the skin of the reflection's face until it looked like parchment about to tear. Arthur froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at his own eyes in the glass. But the eyes looking back weren't his. They were wider. They were darker. Arthur blinked. He rubbed his eyes. When he looked again, the reflection was normal. It looked tired, just like him. There was no grin. "I'm losing my mind," Arthur whispered to the empty room. "I've been working too hard. The fumes from the cleaning, solvents. That's it." It's the chemicals. But deep down, he knew. In a house full of clocks that measured the objective truth of time, something was now operating outside of it. The investigation Arthur couldn't sleep. He spent the entire night sitting in his armchair, listening to the chorus of 100 clocks. Tick, tock, tick, tock. By 3 in the morning, he had convinced himself that the mirror was the problem, not his brain. Maybe it was the silver backing. Maybe the glass had been manufactured with some kind of defect that created a visual echo. It was a stretch, but it was better than the alternative. The next morning, he went to a local hardware store and bought 3 large floor-length mirrors. He brought them home and lined them up in his living room, creating a makeshift hall of mirrors. He wanted to see if the phenomenon was localized to the bathroom or if it followed him. He stood in the center of the room. To his left, a reflection. To his right, a reflection. Directly in front of him, a third. He raised his right arm. Mirror 1. arm raised. Mirror 2, arm raised. Mirror 3, arm raised. He turned in a circle. Everything seemed fine. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was just the bathroom mirror. He would take it down, break it, and bury the shards in the backyard. Problem solved. But then he stopped. He looked at the mirror on the far left. In that reflection, the living room behind him was different. In the real room, his cat, a tabby named Barnaby, was curled up on the rug. In the mirror on the left, the rug was empty. Arthur turned his head to look at the real rug. Barnaby was right there, sleeping soundly. He looked back at the mirror. In the reflection, the door to the kitchen was open. In the real room, Arthur could see out of the corner of his eye that the kitchen door was shut tight. Then, the reflection of Arthur in the left-hand mirror did something truly impossible. While the real Arthur was standing perfectly still with his hands at his sides, the reflection slowly reached into its pocket, pulled out a pocket watch, Arthur's favorite silver Hamilton, and checked the time. The real Arthur's pockets were empty. The barrier-thins Arthur backed away from the mirrors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled into his workshop and locked the door. He didn't know what he was running from. How do you run from your own likeness? He sat at his workbench, the familiar tools offering no comfort now. He looked at the various glass domes covering the clocks he was repairing. Even there, in the curved surfaces of the glass, he could see it. His reflection was moving independently. It was as if a movie was playing on every reflective surface, but the actor was refusing to follow the script. The other Arthur was pacing. It was looking around the workshop. It was touching the tools on the reflected workbench. Arthur grabbed a heavy wrench and smashed the glass dome of a nearby clock. He smashed the window. He smashed the polished chrome of a desk lamp. He went on a rampage through his house, covering every mirror with sheets, breaking every picture frame, and painting over the windows with thick, black acrylic. He lived in darkness for 3 days. He didn't dare turn on the lights, fearing that even a slight shimmer on a polished floorboard would reveal that thing watching him. The sound of one hand clapping. By the 4th day, the silence of the house was broken. But it wasn't the clocks. Arthur had let them all run down. He hadn't wound a single one. For the first time in 30 years, the Miller house was silent. Or it should have been. From behind the sheet-covered mirror in the hallway, Arthur heard a sound. Talk. Just one. A heavy, metallic click. Then a voice. It wasn't a loud voice. It was a dry, raspy whisper that sounded like sandpaper on wood. It was coming from the other side of the glass. Arthur, you forgot to wind the Hamilton. Arthur huddled in the corner of his darkened living room, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. You're not real, he sobbed. You're a reflection. Your light bouncing off a surface. You don't exist. If I don't exist, the voice whispered, accompanied by the sound of a finger tapping on glass from the inside, then who is holding the watch? Arthur couldn't help himself. The curiosity, the sheer, maddening need to know, overcame his terror. He crept toward the hallway. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas sheet covering the large pier mirror that had been in his family for 3 generations. He pulled it down. The switch. The flashlight beam hit the glass. There was Arthur. He looked terrible. His hair was matted, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was covered in dust. But the reflection wasn't holding a flashlight. The reflection was standing in a bright, sunlit version of the hallway. The house behind the glass looked clean and vibrant, and the reflection was holding the silver Hamilton pocket watch. The reflection looked at the watch, then looked at Arthur. It smiled that same horrifying, impossible smile. It's time for a change of pace, don't you think? The reflection said. Its voice didn't come from the air. It came from inside Arthur's own head. Before Arthur could scream, the reflection reached out. Its hand didn't hit the surface of the glass. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, the surface of the mirror rippled like water. A cold, gray hand reached out of the mirror and grabbed Arthur by the throat. The strength was immense. It was the strength of a lifetime of repressed energy. Arthur was pulled forward, his face hitting the cool, liquid surface of the mirror. It felt like plunging his head into a pool of mercury. It was thick, suffocating, and smelled of ozone and old silver. He struggled, kicking his legs, his fingers clawing at the wooden frame of the mirror, but he was being pulled into a vacuum. For a single, agonizing moment, he was suspended between two worlds. He saw his living room dark, messy, and cold, and he saw the other room bright, warm, and inviting. And then, with a violent pop, the world flipped. The silent observer Arthur hit the floor hard. He gasped for air, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and fresh lilies. He scrambled to his feet and looked around. He was in his hallway. The sun was shining through the windows. He felt wonderful. The aches in his joints were gone. He walked toward the mirror to see himself, to see if he was truly whole. He stood in front of the glass. On the other side of the mirror, in a dark, suffocating room filled with broken glass and shadows, a man was screaming. It was Arthur, the real Arthur. He was pounding his fists against the back of the glass, but no sound came through. He looked old. He looked terrified. He looked like a ghost trapped in a cage of shadows. The Arthur standing in the sunlight looked at his counterpart. He felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard satisfaction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver Hamilton watch. He wound it slowly. Click, click, click. "Don't worry, Arthur," the reflection, the new Arthur said, his voice smooth and clear. "I'll take very good care of your life. I'll wind the clocks. I'll fix the watches. I'll even feed Barnaby." The man inside the mirror fell to his knees, his face pressed against the glass, tears streaming down his face. The new Arthur leaned in close, his face just inches from the surface. He didn't mimic the man's despair. Instead, he did the one thing that defies all logic, all physics, and all reason. He leaned forward and fogged the glass with his breath. Then, with a steady finger, he wrote a single word in the condensation on the inside of the mirror, so the man on the dark side could read it. "Mine!" The new Arthur turned away and walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee. The aftermath. In the town of Bennington, Vermont, people noticed a change in Arthur Miller. He seemed younger, he was more social, he laughed more. He still fixed clocks, but he did it with a speed and precision that was almost supernatural. The only thing people found odd was that Arthur had removed every single reflective surface from his home. He sold his mirrors, he replaced his windows with frosted glass, he even stopped wearing his silver watch, opting for a digital one with a matte plastic screen. When asked why, he would simply smile, a wide, perfect, slightly too large smile, and say, "I just don't like the way I look these days." But sometimes, late at night, if you were to walk past the old Miller house and look at the one small, clear pane of glass he missed in the attic, you might see a face. It's a face pressed hard against the glass, eyes wide with a terror that never ends, watching the world go by from a place where time has stopped, and where the reflection is the only thing that's real. And that, my friends, is why you should never look too closely at your reflection when you think you're alone. Because you might just find that the person looking back has plans of their own, and they've been waiting a long, long time to trade places. This story reminds us that our reality is often held together by the thinnest of threads. We trust our senses. We trust that the laws of nature are absolute. We trust that when we look in a mirror, we are seeing ourselves. But in the world of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, trust is a very dangerous word. Arthur Miller spent his life measuring time in seconds, minutes, and hours. He thought he understood the rhythm of the universe, but he forgot that for every light, there is a shadow. And for every person, there is a reflection one that doesn't just mimic, but waits. If you ever feel like your reflection is a half second behind, if you ever think you see a smile in the glass when your own face is sad, don't investigate, don't test it, just walk away. Because some mirrors aren't just glass and silver, they're doors. And once you open a door like that, there is no turning back. Good night. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do here. Today, we are going to dive into a story that challenges the very fabric of our reality. It is a tale that starts with a simple, logical man and ends in a place where logic simply ceases to exist. Now, before we get into it, please gently take the like button out for a nice seafood dinner, and then when the bill comes, excuse yourself to the bathroom and never come back. The Precision of Elias Thorne. The year was 1994, but for Elias Thorne, time had a way of standing still. Elias was a man of precision. He was a retired structural engineer, 62 years of age, with a penchant for blueprints and a deep-seated distrust of anything he could not measure with a steel ruler. He lived in a world of load-bearing walls, foundation depth, and architectural integrity. To Elias, the world was a puzzle that could always be solved if you just had the right mathematics. After his wife Martha passed away in the spring of 1993, Elias found himself wandering through a life that felt far too spacious. Their home in the suburbs of Connecticut felt echoing and hollow. It was a house filled with memories that had nowhere to go, and Elias, being a man of action and structure, decided that a change of scenery was the only way to manage the crushing weight of his grief. So, when he saw an advertisement in a niche architectural journal for a historically unique estate in the deep woods of Vermont, his interest was piqued. The property was known as Blackwood Manor. It was a sprawling Victorian-style monstrosity that had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was an eccentric clockmaker who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a house that many locals refused to enter. Elias drove up to Vermont on a Tuesday in October. The air was crisp, and the leaves were the color of dried blood. When he pulled up the gravel driveway, Blackwood Manor loomed over him like a silent sentinel. It was beautiful, yes, but there was an asymmetry to it that bothered Elias's engineering mind. Windows did not quite line up. The roofline seemed to slant at an angle that should have caused a structural collapse decades ago. It felt as if the house was leaning into a wind that no one else could feel. He was met at the door by a real estate agent named Marcus, a man who looked like he had not slept since the late 70s. Marcus did not say much. He looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. He handed Elias a heavy iron key and told him the owner wanted someone who understands how things are built. But a word of advice, Mr. Thorne, do not look too closely at the Indigo Room. Elias, being a man of science and someone who did not believe in ghost stories or architectural superstitions, naturally went straight to the Indigo Room. The Indigo Room. It was located on the third floor at the very end of a long, narrow hallway lined with fading floral wallpaper that looked like it was wilting. The door was made of heavy, dark oak, and it had no handle, only a small circular indentation where a knob should be. Elias pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a weightless ease that defied its massive appearance. The room was perfectly square, 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were painted a deep, hypnotic shade of indigo that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight rather than reflect it. There was no furniture, no windows, just a single, bare light bulb hanging from a cord in the center of the ceiling. Elias stepped inside, his boots clicking on the polished hardwood floor. He felt a strange sensation in his inner ear, like the sudden drop in pressure you feel when a plane begins its descent. He took out his measuring tape. He wanted to verify the dimensions. 10 feet, exactly. He turned toward the door to mark it on his notepad, and that is when his eyes felt a bit dry. He blinked. It was a normal, involuntary reflex. A split-second closure of the eyelids, but when he opened them, the room felt different. Elias frowned. He looked at the wall in front of him. It seemed a fraction closer. He shook his head, blaming the dim lighting and his aging vision. He walked back to the center of the room and reached for his tape measure again. He dropped his pen, and as he reached down to grab it, he blinked again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The indigo walls had moved. The logic of the impossible. Elias stood up abruptly, his heart skipping a beat. He looked at the door. It was no longer 5 feet away. It was 4 feet and 11 inches. He knew this because his engineer's eye was trained to spot discrepancies of even a quarter inch. He stood perfectly still, his breath hitching in his throat. He stared at the corner of the room, focusing all his willpower on keeping his eyelids open. His eyes began to sting. The air in the room felt incredibly dry, almost as if the walls themselves were sucking the moisture out of the atmosphere. Seconds turned into a minute. His vision began to blur, tears welling up in the corners of his eyes. He tried to fight it. He tried to think of anything else, the way the wind sounded in the pines outside, the smell of Martha's cooking, the blueprints of the Brooklyn Bridge, but the human body has its limits. His eyelids twitched. He tried to hold them open with his fingers, but the reflex was too strong. Blink. The walls surged inward. It was not a slow crawl. It was an instantaneous shift, as if the space between the walls had simply been deleted from reality. The room was now roughly 8 feet by 8 feet. The ceiling, which had been 10 feet high, was now noticeably lower. The light bulb hanging from the cord was now swinging gently, though there was no draft. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Elias's logical armor. He lunged for the door. He grabbed the edge of the oak frame and pulled. It would not budge. It was not locked. It was as if the door had become part of the wall itself, fused together by some impossible molecular bond. Elias began to scream. He hammered on the indigo wood, his fists bruising against the hard surface. "Marcus! Anyone! Open the door!" His voice sounded muffled, as if the indigo paint was made of acoustic foam. There was no echo. The sound just died the moment it left his lips. He realized with a jolt of horror that the more he panicked, the faster he breathed, and the more he needed to blink. Blink. 7 feet. The ceiling was now so low, he had to hunch his shoulders. The indigo room was no longer a room. It was becoming a cell. Elias backed into the center, crouched beneath the swinging light bulb. He was a man who believed in the laws of physics. He believed in gravity, in thermodynamics, in the conservation of mass. But this was a violation of every principle he held dear. The mass of the house was not changing. The space itself was being consumed. He took out his pocket knife, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He tried to wedge the blade into the seam where the door had been, but there was no seam. The indigo was one continuous, unbroken surface. He looked at his watch. It was 4:33 in the afternoon. He realized he had a choice. He could try to keep his eyes open until his brain shut down from exhaustion, or he could accept the inevitable. But Elias Thorne was not a quitter. He sat on the floor, legs crossed, and tilted his head back. He let the tears stream down his face, hoping the moisture would buy him time. He thought about the clockmaker, Arthur Penhaligon. He wondered if Arthur had been the one to build this room, or if he had simply found it. Maybe the room was a clock of a different sort. A clock that did not measure time in seconds, but in the basic biological rhythms of the observer. Every blink was a tick of the second hand. Every contraction was a minute passing. His eyes were burning now, a searing pain that felt like hot needles being pressed into his corneas. His vision went white. He could not hold it. Blink. 6 feet. He was now forced into a fetal position. The walls were pressing against his knees and his back. The ceiling was inches from his head. The light bulb was now touching his shoulder, the heat from the glass singing his shirt. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence you find in the deepest parts of the ocean or in the vacuum of space. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that pressed against his eardrums. Elias realized that the room was not just getting smaller, it was getting denser. The air was becoming harder to breathe, thick with the scent of ozone and old, dry wood. He began to pray. Elias had not prayed since he was a boy in Sunday school, but now the words came back to him in a frantic, disjointed stream. Our Father, who art in heaven, please. Let me wake up. Let this be a dream. But the cold, hard wood against his spine told him this was no dream. This was the most real thing he had ever experienced. He tried to keep his eyes open by sheer force of will, staring at the indigo wall just inches from his nose. He could see the texture of the paint. It was not smooth. It was composed of millions of tiny, swirling patterns like the fingerprints of a giant. They seemed to move, shifting and dancing in the dim light. His eyelids began to flutter. The muscles were failing. He was 62 years old and his body was betraying him. He thought of Martha. He imagined her standing in the kitchen, the sun streaming through the window, calling him for lunch. He tried to hold on to that image, to make it his entire world. Blink. 5 feet. The room was now a coffin. Elias was pinned. His chin was forced against his chest, his knees tucked tightly under his chin. He could not move his arms. He could not even draw a full breath. The indigo walls were cold, unnaturally cold, like ice. He was sobbing now, but there was no room for the sound to travel. The light bulb had shattered against his shoulder when the room contracted, leaving him in total, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the dancing spots behind his eyes, the phosphenes of a dying man's brain. He realized then that the room would never stop. It did not matter if he was inside it or not. The room had its own logic. It was a predatory geometry. It was a space that hungered for the void. He felt the pressure increasing on his ribs. He could hear the bones creaking, a sound like dry branches snapping in a winter wind. He knew that the next blink would likely be his last. There would not be enough room for his body to exist in the three-dimensional plane. What happens to matter when the space it occupies becomes smaller than the matter itself? Does it crush? Does it fold? Or does it simply pop out of existence, like a bubble in a stream? Elias Thorne, the man of measurements, the man of blueprints, the man who believed in the tangible world, closed his eyes for what he knew would be the final time. He did not fight it. He welcomed the darkness. He thought of the word zero, the ultimate measurement, the point where everything ends and nothing begins. He let his muscles relax. He let the reflex take over. Blink. The vanishing 2 days later, Marcus, the real estate agent, returned to Blackwood Manor. He had a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense of dread that he could not quite shake. He had not heard from Mr. Thorne, and the man's car was still parked in the gravel driveway, covered in a thin layer of autumn frost. Marcus climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The house was deathly quiet. He reached the end of the hallway and stood before the indigo room. The door, or where the door had been, was gone. In its place was a solid wall of mahogany, perfectly matching the rest of the hallway's trim. There was no sign that a room had ever existed there, no seam, no handle, no indentation. Marcus ran his hand over the wood. It was cold to the touch. He noticed something on the floor, right where the threshold would have been. He leaned down and picked it up. It was a steel measuring tape. It was bent and twisted, as if it had been put through a high-pressure industrial hydraulic press. It was crushed into a tiny, dense cube of metal, no larger than a marble. Marcus looked at the wall for a long time. He did not call the police. He did not call the authorities. He knew they would not find anything. He simply turned around, walked out of the house, and locked the front door. As he drove away, he looked back at the house in his rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw a flash of indigo in one of the attic windows. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes, the window was gone. The legacy of Blackwood Manor, the legend of Blackwood Manor, persisted for decades after 1994. Local teenagers would often whisper about the shrinking man who lived in the walls. They would dare each other to go up to the 3rd floor and stand at the end of the hallway. Most of them would run away before they even reached the top of the stairs, claiming they felt a crushing pressure in their chests, as if the very air was trying to squeeze the life out of them. Architects and paranormal investigators eventually caught wind of the story. A team from a prestigious university in Massachusetts arrived in 2012 with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging cameras. They spent 3 days inside the house. They found something that defied all logic. When they scanned the area where the indigo room was supposed to be, the radar showed nothing. Not a void, not a solid wall, but a complete lack of data. It was as if that specific coordinate in space-time had been deleted. One researcher, a woman in her late 50s named Dr. Aristone, noted that the house's exterior dimensions did not match the interior square footage. There was a discrepancy of exactly 100 cubic feet. 100 cubic feet, the exact volume of a 10 by 10 by 1 foot space, or perhaps the volume of a man who had been compressed into a singularity. Dr. Aristone did not stay to finish the study. On the third night, she was found in the hallway, staring at the mahogany wall where the door used to be. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated to the size of quarters. Her colleagues said she had not blinked in over 4 hours. They had to physically drag her from the house. She never spoke about what she saw, but for the rest of her life, she refused to enter any room that did not have at least 2 windows and an open door. She passed away in 2021, and her last words were reportedly, "It is still getting smaller." The final measurement, the house was eventually condemned by the county in 2024. They sent a demolition crew to tear it down. The crew started with the outer walls, using a massive wrecking ball to smash through the Victorian timber. But when they reached the 3rd floor, something strange happened. The wrecking ball, a massive sphere of solid steel weighing over 5,000 pounds, struck the area of the indigo room. Instead of smashing through the wood, the ball simply stopped. There was no sound of impact, no vibration. The ball just came to a dead halt, as if it had hit an immovable object of infinite mass. The crane operator tried to pull the ball back, but the cables snapped like sewing thread. The wrecking ball remained suspended in midair, hovering against the side of the house, refusing to fall to the ground. The demolition crew walked away that day and never returned. Today, if you drive through the back roads of Vermont, near the town of Blackwood, you might see the ruins of the manor. The walls have mostly rotted away, and the roof has long since collapsed. But there is one section of the house that remains perfectly intact. A single, indigo-colored cube sitting amidst the rubble. It has no doors, no windows, and no visible way inside. Locals say that if you stand near it during the equinox, you can hear a sound. It is not a scream, and it is not a cry for help. It is the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical clicking. Click, 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 like a clock that is running out of time. Or perhaps like the sound of a man deep inside the indigo darkness, trying one last time to open his eyes. But as we know, in the world of the strange, dark, and mysterious, once the walls start moving, they never truly stop. They just wait for the next person to come along, the next person to walk through the door, the next person to take a deep breath and blink. And that, my friends, is the story of the room that gets smaller every time you blink. It is a reminder that the world is much larger and much stranger than we often care to admit. We spend our lives trying to fit the universe into our little boxes of understanding, never realizing that the universe might just decide to put us in a box of its own, a box that is exactly the size of our own fear. To further understand why this story is so deeply unsettling, we have to look at the psychology of the man involved. Elias Thorne was not some flighty individual prone to hallucinations. He was a man of the earth, a man of iron and concrete. When someone like that experiences something that defies the laws of physics, it hits differently. It suggests that the reality we rely on is just a thin veil. The story of Blackwood Manor is not just about a haunted room. It is about the terror of losing control over the physical world. For 40 or 50 years, you live your life believing that a wall is a wall and a floor is a floor. Then, in one afternoon, that certainty is stripped away. That is a kind of horror that lingers long after the story ends. If you made it this far, you are a legend. We upload stories like this every single week, covering the strange, dark, and mysterious. So if that is something you are into, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a drop. Until next time, keep your eyes open. Seriously. Do not blink. The mystery of Arthur Penhaligon remains unsolved. Some say he is still in there, tucked away in a fold of space that we cannot see. Some say he is the reason the room exists in the first place, that he was trying to build a way to stop time, to keep his own memories from fading. But in his quest to stop the clock, he built something that counts down to zero. Elias Thorne probably thought he was just investigating an old house. He probably thought he was going to buy a property and spend his retirement years looking at the Vermont foliage. But the Indigo Room had other plans. It had been waiting for someone with a precise mind, someone who would notice the shrinking and provide the room with the attention it craved. Every measurement Elias took was an invitation. Every blink was a confirmation. As the years go by, the Indigo Cube in Vermont supposedly gets smaller. Some travelers who have seen it recently claim it is now no larger than a small shed. Others say it is the size of a suitcase. If the pattern holds, one day it will be the size of a marble, then a grain of sand, and then it will simply be gone. And when it disappears, where will Elias Thorne be? Where will Arthur Penhaligon be? Perhaps they will be exactly where they started, in a place where time and space have no meaning, waiting for someone else to look too closely at a wall. Thank you for being part of this journey into the unknown. We will see you in the next one, provided the world stays the same size while we are gone. Stay safe, stay curious, and above all, stay vigilant. The world is a lot smaller than it looks, and it is getting smaller every day. Take care. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do every week. Before we get into today's story, if you could please gently tuck the like button into bed, and then, while it is sleeping, replace its alarm clock with a live beehive, that would be great. The man of measurement, Arthur Penhaligon, was the kind of man who believed in things he could touch, see, and measure. At 62 years old, Arthur had spent nearly 4 decades as a structural engineer in the city of Chicago. His entire life was built on the foundation of physics, load-bearing walls, and the unwavering reliability of mathematics. He was a man who understood that if a beam was rated for 10,000 pounds, it would hold 10,000 pounds. He understood that gravity was a constant and that every action had an equal and opposite reaction. He lived in a quiet, craftsman-style home in the suburbs with his wife of 38 years, Martha. Their life was predictable, comfortable, and entirely devoid of anything that could be described as the supernatural. Arthur was a man of habit. Every morning he woke up at exactly 6:30. He would grind his coffee beans for exactly 45 seconds, and then he would sit on his back porch and read the technical journals that kept him updated on the latest advancements in steel reinforcement. He didn't believe in ghosts, he didn't believe in premonitions, and he certainly didn't believe in things that went bump in the night. To Arthur, the world was a giant machine, and if something went wrong, it was simply because a part had failed or a calculation was off. This rigid worldview was the very thing that made the events starting in the 3rd week of October so devastating. It began at approximately 3 in the morning. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a clock Arthur had meticulously oiled every single year since 1985. Arthur was fast asleep, buried under a thick down comforter, when he was suddenly jolted awake. It wasn't a loud noise that woke him, but rather a physical sensation. It felt as though someone had reached into his throat with a pair of cold, thin pincers and lightly plucked his vocal cords like the strings of a cello. He sat up, rubbing his neck, his heart rate beginning to climb. Martha was beside him, breathing deeply in her sleep, her face peaceful in the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. Arthur cleared his throat, expecting to feel the scratchiness of a cold or perhaps a bit of acid reflux. He opened his mouth to test his voice, intending to whisper a simple hello to the empty room, just to prove to himself that he was fine. But before he could form the word, before he could even push air from his lungs, a sound emerged from his mouth. It wasn't a hello, it wasn't even Arthur's voice. It was a low, gravelly rasp, a voice that sounded like wet stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep well. It said a single word. Finally, Arthur froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't moved his tongue, he hadn't used his diaphragm, he hadn't even opened his mouth more than a sliver. The word had simply manifested. It felt as if the sound had bypassed his entire respiratory system and resonated directly out of the hollow cavity of his mouth, as if his throat were merely a speaker for a radio located somewhere else entirely. He sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the shadows on the wall, waiting for it to happen again. He felt a phantom vibration lingering in his larynx, a coldness that wouldn't go away. He eventually convinced himself it was a hypnagogic hallucination, a trick of the mind occurring between sleep and wakefulness. He told himself that the brain, when transitioning from REM sleep, can sometimes produce vivid auditory illusions. He was a man of science, after all. There had to be a logical explanation. He went back to sleep, but his dreams were filled with the image of a second mouth opening inside his chest, hidden beneath his ribs. The uninvited guest. 3 days passed without incident. Arthur began to relax, chalking the event up to stress or perhaps a strange reaction to the new blood pressure medication he had started taking 6 months prior. He went back to his blueprints, back to his coffee, and back to his quiet life. But the universe wasn't done with him. On Friday evening, Arthur and Martha were hosting a small dinner party for their neighbors, the Millers. David and Sarah Miller were the kind of people who talked about property taxes and garden mulch. The atmosphere was warm and mundane. The smell of roasted chicken with rosemary and thyme filled the dining room. They were discussing the local school board elections, a topic as boring as it gets. Arthur reached for his glass of red wine, intending to take a sip, while David Miller explained his thoughts on the new high school stadium. Arthur's mouth was closed. He was listening intently, nodding his head in polite agreement. Suddenly, David stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide, and his silver fork clattered onto his porcelain plate. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her wine glass nearly slipping from her fingers. "Arthur," Martha whispered, her face turning a ghostly shade of pale. "What did you just say?" Arthur looked at her, confused. "I didn't say anything, Martha. I was listening to David. I haven't said a word in 3 minutes." "You did," David said, his voice trembling. "Arthur, your mouth didn't move. You were holding your glass to your lips. But a voice, it came right out of you. It sounded like it was coming from deep inside your chest." Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His skin felt clammy and tight. "What did it say, David?" David swallowed hard, looking at his wife, then back at Arthur. It said, "The foundations are rotting in the northwest corner. It told us to look at the cracks before the winter freeze." And Arthur, it wasn't your voice. It sounded like an old woman who hasn't spoken in 50 years. It was thin and sharp, like a razor blade. The room went deathly silent. Arthur felt a sickening vibration in his neck, a phantom hum that lingered long after the words were spoken. He didn't tell them that he had spent the last 2 weeks worrying about a hairline crack he'd found in the northwest corner of their basement foundation. He hadn't told a soul, not even Martha. He had planned to fix it himself when the weather turned dry. How could a voice coming from his own body know his secret thoughts? The medical maze. The following Monday, Arthur began a descent into the world of modern medicine that would defy every logical explanation. He was a man who trusted doctors because medicine was based on biology, and biology was just another form of engineering. He saw a general practitioner, then an ear, nose, and throat specialist, and finally a neurologist. He underwent 3 separate magnetic resonance imaging scans, MRIs. He had CT scans that mapped every centimeter of his brain and torso. He had a laryngoscopy where a small camera was fed down his throat to watch his vocal cords in real time. He stood in cold rooms while doctors studied the monitors, looking for a physical cause for the vocalizations. They found nothing. No tumors, no neurological glitches, no parasitic twin scenarios that you might read about in a tabloid. Physically, Arthur Penhaligon was a perfect specimen of a 62-year-old male. Maybe it's a form of Tourette's, one doctor suggested, though he sounded unconvinced, tapping his pen against a clipboard, or perhaps complex partial seizures manifesting as vocalizations. It's rare, but the brain can do strange things when the electrical signals get crossed. "But my mouth doesn't move," Arthur argued, his voice cracking with desperation. and I don't know the things the voice says. It's not me, it's something else using my equipment. It's like someone is broadcasting a signal and I'm just the antenna. The neurologist, a man with 40 years of experience named Dr. Holloway, simply shook his head. Mr. Penhaligon, what you're describing is physiologically impossible. Speech requires the coordinated movement of the diaphragm to push air, the lungs to provide the volume, the larynx to create the vibration, and the tongue and lips to shape the sound. To produce a clear, multisyllabic sentence without moving those parts, it defies the laws of acoustics and human biology. It would be like a car engine running without any fuel or spark plugs. Arthur left the office feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He began to withdraw from the world. He stopped going to his engineering firm, claiming he had a persistent flu. He stopped seeing friends. He spent his days sitting in his mahogany-paneled study, a digital voice recorder sitting on the desk in front of him, waiting. He had become a prisoner in his own home, terrified of what his own body might do next. He wanted to catch it. He wanted proof that he wasn't losing his mind. He began to keep a log, writing down every time he felt the vibration, every time the air in the room seemed to grow heavy and stagnant. The recordings on the night of November 12th, Arthur hit record on his device and sat in the dark. He stayed awake for as long as he could, the silence of the house weighing down on him like a lead blanket. Around 2:45 in the morning, he began to drift off, his chin sinking toward his chest. His head suddenly snapped back as a violent vibration erupted in his throat. It didn't feel like speaking. It felt like a low-voltage electric shock passing through his neck. He looked at the voice recorder. The little red light was blinking. The level meter on the small screen was spiking into the red zone, indicating a sound that was far too loud for a whisper. Arthur's mouth was clamped shut. He could feel his own teeth grinding together with such force that he thought they might shatter. But from behind his teeth, from the dark depths of his esophagus, a voice emerged. It was louder this time. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant or a ritualistic prayer. 7, 14, 21, 28. The water rises, the bridge breaks at 35. Don't go to the valley. The valley is a grave. The valley is a grave. The voice stopped as abruptly as it had started. Arthur fell out of his chair, gasping for air, clutching the edge of his desk. He felt as though someone had been sitting on his chest, squeezing the oxygen out of him. He grabbed the recorder with shaking hands and played it back. The recording was crystal clear. It was a voice that was both high-pitched and ancient, layered with a secondary tone that sounded like electronic static. It was impossible. It was the sound of a person speaking from a place that wasn't a throat. It sounded as if the air itself inside his chest was being vibrated by an external force. The next morning, Arthur sat in his kitchen, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. He turned on the television to the local news. A flash flood had hit a valley town 3 counties over during a freak midnight thunderstorm. A bridge had collapsed at precisely 5:35 a.m. as a commuter bus was crossing. The number of people missing? 28. Arthur sat in his kitchen, the cold coffee in his mug forgotten. He wasn't just hearing a voice, he was a vessel for something that knew the future. Something that knew things it had no way of knowing. The man of measurement, the man of science, was looking into an abyss that didn't have a bottom. He began to realize that his body was no longer his own. He was a biological house, and something else had moved into the guest room. The breech Martha tried to help him. She really did. She was a woman of incredible patience, but the strain was tearing them apart. She couldn't look at him anymore without a glimmer of fear in her eyes. It was the kind of fear you have when you see a stray dog that might bite or a cracked wall that might collapse. She had heard the voice twice more, once while they were eating breakfast and once while they were watching a movie. Both times, the voice had spoken in a language neither of them recognized, a guttural, clicking tongue that felt oily and heavy, as Martha described it. "Arthur, please," Martha begged one evening, her voice breaking. "We need to go to a priest, or a medium, or a psychic. I don't care how crazy it sounds. This isn't medical, this isn't a seizure, this is something else. It's like there is a person inside you trying to get out. Arthur, the man of science, finally relented. He was desperate. He had lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. He couldn't sleep. He was terrified to close his eyes. He contacted a woman named Eleanor, a spiritual consultant who had been recommended by a friend of a friend. Eleanor was 70 years old, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to see right through the physical world and into the gears of the universe. They met in Arthur's living room on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining outside, but inside the house, it felt like twilight. Eleanor sat across from him on the sofa, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Tell me what happened, Arthur," she said softly. "Don't leave anything out." Arthur explained everything. He talked about the dates, the times, the medical tests, the recordings. He played the tape of the bridge prophecy for her. As he spoke, he felt that familiar, sickening hum beginning in his chest. It started as a low thrum, like a distant idling truck. His throat tightened. He tried to swallow, but he couldn't. His windpipe felt as if it were being constricted by an invisible hand. Eleanor's expression shifted from sympathy to intense, vibrating focus. "It's coming, isn't it? Right now?" She stood up and walked toward him, her eyes wide. Arthur nodded, his eyes bulging with terror. He clamped his hands over his mouth, his fingers digging into his cheeks, trying to physically hold the sound back. He wanted to keep the door shut. He wanted to stay Arthur Penhaligon, the structural engineer. It didn't matter. The voice erupted. It was so loud this time that the glass panes in the nearby china hutch began to vibrate and ring. It wasn't the old woman's voice, and it wasn't the wet stone rasp. It was a booming, echoing roar that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a collective scream that resonated through the floorboards and into the very marrow of Arthur's bones. "We are the ones who were forgotten. We are the space between the heartbeats. Arthur is the door." The door is now unlocked. The architecture is complete. Eleanor stood up so fast her chair tipped over backward, crashing against the hardwood floor. She wasn't looking at Arthur's face. She was looking at his neck, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of her own. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely get the words out. "Don't move." "Oh my God, don't move." In the mirror over the fireplace, Arthur saw it. He saw the thing that defied every law of physics he had ever studied. Under the skin of his neck, something was moving. It wasn't a muscle twitch or a pulse. It looked like a pair of tiny, translucent hands were pressing against the inside of his throat, the fingers clearly visible under the stretched, pale skin. They were trying to push their way out. The skin stretched to the point of tearing, becoming so thin that it was nearly transparent. Arthur tried to scream, but he had no control over his own vocal apparatus. The voices had total dominion. He felt his jaw being forced open by a strength that wasn't his own. It felt like his bones were being rearranged, his ligaments being stretched like rubber bands. The disappearance of logic. What happened next is documented only in a frantic, disjointed 911 call placed by Martha Penhaligon at 11:14 p.m. that night. The police arrived shortly after, but the recording of that call is something that the dispatchers in that precinct still talk about in hushed tones during the late shift. In the recording, Martha is hysterical. She is screaming that her husband is turning inside out. She is shouting that he is glowing, that there is a light coming from his mouth that shouldn't exist. In the background of the call, a sound can be heard that the police later described as the mechanical failure of a massive structure. It was a series of wet, tearing noises followed by a sound like a pipe organ being played by a hurricane. It was a sound of immense pressure and ancient power. When the police arrived at the Penhaligon residence 12 minutes later, they found the front door wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. Martha was found catatonic on the front lawn, sitting in the grass and staring at the house with unblinking eyes. Eleanor, the consultant, was nowhere to be found. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse was still on the sofa, but she had vanished into the night as if she had never existed. Inside the house, the living room was a scene of impossible, methodical carnage. There was no blood, there was no sign of a struggle or a break-in, but every single piece of furniture in the room had been dismantled, not broken, but dismantled into its core components. The sofa was no longer a sofa, but a neat pile of wood, metal springs, and individual tufts of fabric. The television was a precise arrangement of circuit boards, glass shards, and copper wiring spread across the carpet. It was as if a master engineer had taken the room apart piece by piece in a matter of seconds. And Arthur was in the center of the room. He was standing perfectly still, his feet slightly off the ground, hovering an inch above the floor. His mouth was open wider than a human mouth should ever be able to open. His jaw appeared to be completely unhinged, hanging down toward his chest. The first officer on the scene, a veteran of 22 years named Sergeant Miller, approached Arthur slowly, his heart racing. "Mr. Penhaligon?" the officer asked, drawing his weapon but keeping it lowered toward the floor. "Arthur, can you hear me? We are here to help you." Arthur didn't turn his head, he didn't blink, he didn't show any sign that he was aware of the officer's presence. But from his open, gaping mouth, a sound began to emerge. It wasn't a voice this time. It wasn't a prophecy or a threat. It was the sound of a choir. Thousands upon thousands of voices singing a melody so complex, so haunting, and so beautiful that Sergeant Miller later reported he felt an overwhelming urge to weep and fall to his knees. It was a sound that defied the physics of a human chest cavity. It was too big for a human body to contain. It was as if Arthur's mouth had become a portal to a cathedral miles wide, a space that existed outside of time and geography. As the officers watched, frozen in place by the sheer impossibility of the scene, Arthur began to fade. He didn't vanish like a ghost in a movie, but rather like a photograph left in the scorching sun for too long. He became translucent, then transparent. You could see the wallpaper through his torso. You could see the floor through his feet. He looked like a sketch made of smoke. And then, with one final earth-shaking note from the choir, a note that shattered every window in the house, Arthur Penhaligon simply ceased to be. He didn't pop, he didn't explode, and he didn't leave a trace. He just wasn't there anymore. The space where he had been standing was empty, and the silence that followed was the heaviest thing Sergeant Miller had ever felt. The aftermath. The official police report listed Arthur Penhaligon as a missing person. The case remains open to this day, though it has moved into the cold case files at the precinct. There were no signs of foul play, no forensic evidence of a crime, and no body was ever recovered. The house was eventually sold, but the new owners didn't stay long. They claimed the air always felt like it was vibrating, like a speaker that was turned on but playing no music. Martha Penhaligon moved away 2 months later to live with her sister in Arizona. She refused to speak to the press. But in a brief interview with a private investigator 3 years after the incident, she said something that still haunts the local authorities. She said, "The doctors were wrong. Everyone was wrong. They said it was impossible for a voice to come out of a closed mouth because they were thinking about biology, but they were looking at it the wrong way. The voice wasn't coming out of Arthur. Arthur was being pulled into the voice. He was being hollowed out to make room for something much larger than a man. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a blueprint for a place that hasn't been built yet." To this day, neighbors of the old Penhaligon house claim that on certain nights, specifically in the third week of October, if you stand near the northwest corner of the property and keep very, very quiet, you can hear something. It isn't the wind. It isn't the sound of the nearby highway or the rustle of the trees. It's the sound of a man's voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It's not speaking English, and it's not speaking the clicking tongue Martha heard. It's the sound of a man reciting structural engineering formulas, calculations for load-bearing walls, and the tensile strength of steel, over and over in a tone of absolute, mind-bending terror. It's the sound of a man trying to measure a world that has no measurements. The most disturbing part of this story, however, came 6 years after Arthur vanished. A group of urban explorers was investigating an abandoned sanatorium 300 miles away in rural Pennsylvania. The building had been closed since the 1960s, a crumbling ruin of brick and ivy. In one of the basement rooms, which had been sealed behind a heavy iron door that appeared to have been welded shut from the inside, they found a small, black object sitting in the middle of the floor. It was a modern digital recorder. It was the exact model Arthur Penhaligon had used in his study. There was no dust on it, despite the room being covered in decades of grime. The battery was at 100%. The explorers, confused and frightened, turned it on. There was only one file on the device, dated for a year, that hadn't happened yet. When they played it, they didn't hear a ghost or a monster. They heard the sound of Arthur's voice, his real voice, the one Martha had loved for nearly 40 years. He sounded calm, which was the most terrifying part of all. It was the calm of someone who has finally accepted a terrible truth. He said, "I am not alone in here. There are so many of us. We are the voices you hear when you think you're dreaming. We are the reason you wake up at 3 in the morning for no reason at all, feeling like someone is watching you. We are the echoes of the things that were here before the world was built. We are waiting for our turn to speak, and soon everyone will be a door." Then the recording ended with the sound of 1,000 mouths all opening at once, a wet, clicking sound that echoed through the empty sanatorium like a death rattle. The case of Arthur Penhaligon remains one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. It challenges everything we know about biology, acoustics, and the very nature of the human soul. We like to think that our bodies are our own, that we are the masters of our hands, our eyes, and our voices. We believe that the skin is a border, a wall that keeps the outside world out and our true selves in. But if Arthur's story teaches us anything, it's that we might just be the temporary tenants of a very crowded house. We are the structural engineers of our own lives, building foundations and walls, but we forget that the ground beneath us is alive. And sometimes the other tenants, the ones who lived there before the foundations were poured, decide they've been quiet for long enough. So the next time you're alone in a quiet room and you feel that tiny electric hum in the back of your throat or that cold vibration in your chest that you can't quite explain, maybe don't try to speak. Don't test your voice. Because you might not like who or what decides to speak for you. And once that door is unlocked, there is no way to close it again. If you found this story interesting, please check out our other videos where we deep dive into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Until next time.